The motor pool sat empty at 0430, nothing but dust and diesel fumes hanging in the Afghan darkness. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez moved between the wraps with a flashlight, checking tire pressure and fluid levels while the rest of FOB Sentinel slept. For months she had been doing this. For months of being invisible, which was exactly what she wanted. She crouched beside the rear axle of her assigned vehicle and ran her fingers along the undercarriage, feeling for damage the way a surgeon might probe for fractures. Her hands knew what to look for without her mind needing to guide them. 11 years of muscle memory did not disappear just because she had filed transfer paperwork and asked for a logistics assignment at the edge of nowhere. The transmission on this MRAP was failing. She had reported it twice. Both times Master Sergeant Cunningham had laughed and told her to figure it out herself, since she was supposed to be a driver. Vasquez finished her inspection and stood, her eyes automatically scanning the perimeter fence 200 meters out. Old habits. She tracked the guard rotation, noted the gap in coverage near the eastern tower, calculated response times if something came over that wire. Then she forced herself to stop. She was a convoy driver now. Threat assessment was someone else's job. Footsteps approached from the barracks. Heavy boots, confident stride, the slight drag of someone who had never learned to move quietly because he had never needed to. She knew who it was before he emerged from the shadows. Master Sergeant Dale Cunningham walked into the motor pool with 3 of his sergeants trailing behind him. Rodriguez, Mills, and Chun formed a loose semicircle as Cunningham approached Vasquez with his flashlight aimed directly at her face. "Well, look who is here early," he said, trying to figure out which end of the truck goes forward. The sergeants showed their approval through nods and quiet laughter. Vasquez said nothing. She had learned that responding only extended these encounters. Cunningham circled her vehicle and crouched where she had been inspecting moments earlier. He ran his hand along a section of undercarriage and stood up holding fingers glistening with oil. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "You have an oil leak, and you were going to take this out on Convoy?" "There is no oil leak," Vasquez replied, her voice flat. "That is residual from the last fluid change. The seals are intact." Cunningham stepped closer. His jaw tightened, and his voice dropped to something meant to intimidate. "Are you telling me I do not know what an oil leak looks like? I have been running convoys since you were in middle school learning to put on makeup. If you check the maintenance log, you will see the seals were replaced 6 weeks ago. Normal residual takes 8 weeks to fully clear in this climate." For a moment, something shifted in Cunningham's expression. Most soldiers in her position would have backed down, apologized, accepted the correction whether it was valid or not. Vasquez had simply stated facts without emotion, without deference, and that confused him. His confusion curdled into anger. He turned to his sergeants. "You hear that? The quota higher thinks she knows more about these vehicles than I do." Rodriguez shook his head in theatrical disappointment. Mills muttered something about diversity training ruining the Army. Chin stayed quiet, his eyes fixed somewhere past Vasquez rather than on her. "You know what?" Cunningham said, his satisfaction returning. "Forget your usual vehicle. You're taking 37 today. Tail position." Vehicle 37 was the oldest MRAP on base. Its transmission slipped on inclines, its radio cut out above 40 miles per hour, and its air conditioning had failed 3 weeks ago. Taking it on a 12-hour convoy through summer heat was a punishment assignment, and everyone present knew it. "If you want to question me again," Cunningham added, "maybe next time I will have you walk alongside the convoy instead of riding in it." He turned and walked away, his sergeants falling in a step behind him. Chin glanced back once, something unreadable in his expression, before disappearing into the darkness between buildings. Vasquez stood alone in the motor pool. She allowed herself one slow breath, then walked to Vehicle 37 and began her inspection from the beginning. The mounted M2 had not been properly maintained. Dust in the receiver, dry firing pin, ammunition belt showing signs of corrosion. She cleaned it methodically, her hands moving through the familiar process while her mind calculated distances and angles out of pure reflex. If you're watching this right now from somewhere like Texas or Arizona, you probably know something about long roads and even longer patience. About doing a job, right even when no one notices and no one cares. About the kind of silence that comes before everything changes. She finished with the M2 and moved to her personal weapons. Her M4 came apart in her hands like it was made of water, each component checked and oiled and reassembled in under 2 minutes. Her sidearm received the same treatment. These were the movements of someone who had performed them thousands of times in conditions far worse than a quiet motor pool at dawn. The sun began to rise over the mountains to the east, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Vasquez watched it for a moment, then returned to work. In 6 hours, she would be driving into the Corangal Valley with a failing transmission, a half-functional radio, and a commander who thought she was worthless. She had survived worse. She had survived things that did not officially exist, done by people whose names would never appear in any record. But that was someone else. Someone she had buried 18 months ago alongside 6 teammates whose faces still visited her dreams. Today she was just a driver, and drivers did what they were told. Captain Marcus Webb had spent 9 years learning to see what other people missed. Intelligence work was not about secrets or classified documents. It was about patterns, the small inconsistencies that revealed larger truths, the details that did not fit. He sat in his office reviewing drone footage from last week's convoy run, a routine task that most officers delegated to enlisted analysts. Webb preferred to do it himself. Analysts look for threats. Webb looked for everything else. The footage showed 6 vehicles moving through a narrow valley passage, standard formation, nothing remarkable. He was about to close the file when something caught his attention. He rewound the footage and watched again. Vehicle 6. The tail position, MRAP driven by Staff Sergeant Vasquez. Every other vehicle in the convoy showed the slight wobbles and corrections of normal driving. Vasquez's vehicle moved differently. The spacing between her and Vehicle 5 remained constant within a meter, even through turns and elevation changes. When the lead vehicle slowed unexpectedly, her MRAP adjusted before the brake lights of the vehicle ahead had fully illuminated. Webb pulled up her service record. Elena Vasquez, age 34, logistics specialist trained at Fort Lee. 8 years of service, all of it in support roles. Transportation, supply chain, vehicle maintenance. Nothing in her file suggested tactical training beyond basic soldier skills. He watched the footage a third time. That kind of spatial awareness, that anticipatory driving, did not come from Fort Lee. It came from high-speed convoy operations in hostile territory, where maintaining spacing meant the difference between surviving an ambush and dying in one. Webb saved the footage to a separate folder and pulled up the morning formation schedule. Vasquez's unit assembled at 0700 in the yard outside the motor pool. He had 30 minutes. He used the time to review her personnel file more carefully. Born in El Paso, enlisted at 19. Steady promotions, solid valuations, nothing exceptional. Her photograph showed a woman with dark hair and an expression that revealed nothing. Webb had seen that look before. He had seen it in the mirror after his 3rd deployment, and he had seen it in the eyes of operators who had done things that left marks invisible to everyone except those who carried similar scars. The formation assembled on schedule. Webb watched from his office window, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. Vasquez stood in the 2nd row, technically at attention, but somehow different from the soldiers around her. It took Webb a moment to identify what he was seeing. Her position gave her clear sight lines to every entrance point. The motor pool doors to her left, the gap between buildings to her right, the main road behind her visible in her peripheral vision. She had chosen that spot instinctively, the way a predator chooses high ground. Master Sergeant Cunningham walked the formation, stopping occasionally to inspect uniforms or correct posture. When he reached Vasquez, he leaned in close and said something that made the soldiers nearby shift uncomfortably. Vasquez did not react. Her expression never changed. Her posture never tensed. That kind of control required training. Emotional regulation under provocation was a skill taught in very specific programs. The formation ended and soldiers dispersed. Webb kept watching as Vasquez walked toward the motor pool. Her gait was controlled, efficient, nothing wasted. Most soldiers walked like they were going somewhere. Vasquez moved like she was always ready to go somewhere else entirely. She passed within 50 meters of his window, close enough for Webb to see her hands. The calluses were wrong. Steering wheels and vehicle maintenance created specific patterns on the palms and fingers. What he saw on Vasquez suggested something else entirely. The webbing between thumb and forefinger was thickened in a way consistent with thousands of hours gripping a rifle stock. Her forearms showed faint discoloration, old burns in a pattern Webb recognized. Brass ejection, shell casings bouncing off skin during sustained fire. He returned to his desk and opened a classified query terminal. His clearance level allowed access to most personnel databases, but certain files remained locked behind compartmentalized security. He typed in her name and service number, then added a request flag for any restricted records. The system processed for a moment, then returned a standard result. No additional records found. But Webb noticed something else. A small indicator in the corner of his screen showed that his query had been logged and forwarded to an external server. Somewhere, someone had been notified that a captain at FOB Sentinel was asking questions about Elena Vasquez. Fort Bragg. The server ping traced to Fort Bragg, home of the Joint Special Operations Command. Webb leaned back in his chair. Logistics specialists from Fort Lee did not have flags on their files that pinged JSOC servers. Supply clerks did not move like hunters. Drivers did not have the hands of shooters. He closed the query terminal and opened a new file. At the top, he typed 3 words. Who is she? Somewhere in North Carolina, a notification appeared on a secure terminal in a building that did not officially exist. An analyst looked at the screen, noted the query origin, and picked up a phone. Within the hour, a colonel would be reviewing a file marked with a code name that had been inactive for 18 months. Silhouette, the asset they had been quietly searching for since she disappeared from a hospital in Germany, had just resurfaced at a remote forward operating base in Afghanistan. And someone was asking questions. Sergeant First Class Danielle Porter had been a combat medic for 12 years. She had treated gunshot wounds in Fallujah, stabilized blast victims in Kandahar, and held the hands of soldiers who would not survive the helicopter ride to the field hospital. Bodies told stories that mouths refused to speak. Scars mapped histories that personnel files never recorded. The quarterly physical examinations were routine duty, the kind of task that most medical NCOs rush through with clipboard efficiency. Porter took her time. She had learned that 15 minutes of careful observation could reveal problems that soldiers would never voluntarily report. Staff Sergeant Vasquez arrived at the medical tent at 0900, precisely on schedule. Porter noted that immediately, most soldiers drifted in late for physicals, treating them as an inconvenience to be minimized. Vasquez entered like she was reporting for mission briefing. Master Sergeant Cunningham had stopped by earlier that morning, allegedly to check on a blister, but really to make comments about the day's examination schedule. Make sure you check if she can actually lift a wrench, he had said. I have my doubts about her physical qualifications. Porter had responded with a flat stare that made him leave faster than he intended. She gestured for Vasquez to sit on the examination table. The standard physical involved vital signs, blood draw, vision and hearing checks, and a general assessment of physical condition. Porter began with blood pressure, wrapping the cuff around Vasquez's left arm. 118/76, Porter said. Good numbers. You exercise regularly? When I can, Vasquez replied. Her voice was neutral, cooperative without being warm. Porter made her notes and prepared the blood draw kit. She had performed this procedure thousands of times and could read patients by their response. Some looked away. Some watched the needle. Some tensed involuntarily, no matter how hard they tried to relax. Vasquez did none of these things. She extended her arm, watched the needle enter the vein, and maintained the same steady breathing throughout. Her heart rate on the monitor never flickered. Porter had seen that level of physiological control exactly twice before, both times in patients who had completed specialized training that taught operatives to defeat polygraph examinations. She labeled the blood samples and set them aside. Now came the part that most soldiers disliked. "I need you to remove your top for the physical assessment." Vasquez complied without hesitation. She pulled her tan undershirt over her head and sat with her hands resting on her knees. Porter kept her expression professionally neutral, but her mind began cataloging what she saw. The logistics specialist from Fort Lee had a body that told a very different story than her service record. 3 circular scars on the left side of her torso, entry wounds from small caliber rounds, professionally treated but unmistakably the result of being shot. A larger irregular scar below her right shoulder blade, the signature pattern of shrapnel extraction. Surgical scars along her abdomen suggesting internal repairs, the kind performed after blast trauma. Burn marks on both forearms in patterns consistent with close proximity to explosions or sustained automatic weapons fire. Porter moved closer, examining the wounds with clinical attention. These scars were not fresh. The tissue had fully matured, placing the injuries at minimum 2 years old, probably closer to 3. She checked Vasquez's medical file on her tablet. No recorded injuries requiring surgery. No hospitalization beyond a minor infection treated at Fort Lee 4 years ago. According to the official record, the woman sitting in front of her had never been seriously wounded. "I need to document any significant scarring," Porter said carefully. "Can you tell me about these injuries?" "Motorcycle accident," Vasquez replied. "Happened before I enlisted. Records must not have transferred properly." The lie was delivered with perfect composure. Her heart rate held steady, her breathing unchanged, her eyes meeting Porter's without evasion. But Porter had seen enough combat injuries to know what she was looking at. Motorcycle accidents did not leave bullet wounds. Civilian trauma did not create the specific patterns of military-grade shrapnel extraction. Porter completed the examination in silence, checking range of motion and joint stability. Vasquez moved with fluid efficiency, no restrictions, no favoring of old injuries despite the extensive damage her body had sustained. That suggested ongoing physical maintenance, the kind of disciplined rehabilitation that special operations personnel underwent to remain mission capable. The examination ended. Vasquez dressed and stood, waiting for dismissal. "Everything looks good," Porter said. "I will have your blood work results in 48 hours. Vasquez nodded and left the tent without additional conversation. Porter sat alone with her notes, reading through what she had documented. The woman who had just left carried wounds that should have ended a military career. Instead, she was driving supply convoys at a remote outpost, enduring harassment from a superior who had no idea what he was dealing with. She photographed her notes with her personal phone, a violation of protocol that she justified as necessary precaution. Then she opened her laptop and searched the base directory for Captain Marcus Webb. She had seen him watching the motor pool formation that morning, his attention fixed on the same soldier who had just revealed a body full of impossible scars. Porter typed a brief message. "I think we should compare notes on a mutual subject of interest. Medical tent, 1,400 hours come alone." She sent it before she could reconsider. Somewhere on this base, there was a woman whose official story did not match her physical evidence. Porter had spent 12 years learning to read bodies. This one was written in a language she recognized but could not fully translate. She needed someone with different expertise to help fill in the gaps. Master Sergeant Dale Cunningham stood at the front of the briefing room with a map of the Karangal Valley projected on the wall behind him. 12 soldiers sat in folding chairs, waiting for the convoy brief that would send them into one of the most dangerous stretches of road in Afghanistan. He had spent 15 minutes preparing. 15 minutes was more than enough for a routine supply run. "All right, listen up," he said. "Standard formation, 6 vehicles, departure at 1300. We are running ammunition and medical supplies to Firebase Phoenix. Route takes us through the valley. Estimated travel time, 11 hours with the return trip. Questions?" A young specialist in the front row raised his hand. Sergeant, the intelligence summary mentioned increased insurgent activity along the northern ridge. Should we request air cover? Cunningham waved dismissively. The intelligence nerds see shadows everywhere. We have run this route 15 times without incident. They get paid to be paranoid. We get paid to deliver supplies. From her seat in the back row, Elena Vasquez studied the projected map with eyes that saw what Cunningham refused to acknowledge. The route passed through 3 natural choke points where the road narrowed between steep terrain. Any competent tactician would identify them as optimal ambush positions. High ground on both sides, limited vehicle maneuverability, restricted fields of fire for anyone caught in the kill zone. She had fought in valleys like this one. She had planned ambushes in terrain exactly like this. And she had watched convoys die in places where the geography favored the attackers and the defenders had nowhere to run. Her jaw tightened. For months ago, she had tried to raise concerns about a similar route. Cunningham had laughed and asked if she wanted him to hold her hand during the scary parts. She had not spoken up since. Cunningham assigned vehicle positions with the casual indifference of someone distributing office supplies. Vasquez heard her name paired with Vehicle 37 and tail position, exactly as she expected. The worst vehicle in the worst spot, where she would eat dust for 11 hours and be the last to know if something went wrong at the front of the column. Corporal Jennings leaned toward the soldier beside him and spoke just loud enough for others to hear. At least if we get hit, she will be far enough back to run away. That is what women do, right? A few soldiers laughed uncomfortably. Specialist Torres, sitting 2 seats from Vasquez, stared at the floor and said nothing. His silence felt heavier than the laughter. Cunningham either did not hear the comment or chose to ignore it. He wrapped up the briefing with a reminder about radio protocols and dismissed the group to prepare their vehicles. Vasquez walked to the motor pool alone. Vehicle 37 sat at the end of the row, its armor panels faded and scratched, its tires showing more wear than regulations allowed. She climbed into the driver's seat and tested the radio. Static on 3 channels, partial reception on 2 others. The main frequency worked but cut out when she adjusted the squelch. She moved to the turret and inspected the M2 she had cleaned that morning. It would fire. She had made certain of that. But the ammunition belt showed corrosion that should have been addressed weeks ago, and the traverse mechanism stuck slightly when rotating left. In a firefight, that hesitation could cost seconds. Seconds meant lives. The other drivers prepared their vehicles with a relaxed attitude of soldiers who trusted their leadership and their equipment. Vasquez prepared hers with the methodical focus of someone who trusted neither. She checked her personal weapons last. The M4 came apart in her hands. Each component inspected and returned to its place with movements that required no conscious thought. Her sidearm received the same attention. Magazine springs, firing pin, extractor claw. Everything functioned. Everything would work when she needed it. Torres approached her vehicle as she finished reassembling her rifle. He stopped a few feet away, hesitating like a man who wanted to say something but could not find the words. Vasquez looked at him and waited. I wanted to say that what Jennings said was out of line. Torres finally managed. I should have spoken up. I am sorry. She studied him for a moment. His discomfort was genuine, his apology sincere but insufficient. Sorry did not change the fact that he had stayed silent while she was mocked. Sorry did not undo 4 months of watching harassment happen and doing nothing to stop it. You should have, she agreed. But you did not. Maybe next time. Torres nodded and walked away, shame visible in the slope of his shoulders. Vasquez watched him go, then turned back to her vehicle. The convoy would depart in 2 hours. 11 hours through hostile territory with inadequate preparation, compromised equipment, and a commander who dismissed every warning as paranoia. She had seen this before. She had seen what happened when arrogance met ambush in places where the terrain did not forgive mistakes. But she was just a driver now. Drivers followed orders and trusted their leadership and kept their concerns to themselves. She climbed into Vehicle 37 and waited for the order to move out. Somewhere in the mountains ahead, men with rifles were watching the road and waiting for targets. Vasquez could feel it the way she had always felt it, that primal awareness that something was wrong even when the evidence remained invisible. She checked her weapons one more time and said nothing to anyone. The Karangal Valley swallowed the convoy like a throat swallowing prey. Mountains rose on both sides, their slopes covered in sparse vegetation that provided concealment for anyone patient enough to wait. Vasquez guided Vehicle 37 through the narrow road, feeling the transmission slip every time the incline steepened. She had driven through terrain like this before. Different continent, different war, same geometry of death. The valley created a natural funnel that channeled movement into predictable patterns. Anyone watching from the ridges could track the convoy's progress and calculate exactly when it would reach the optimal kill zone. The radio crackled with fragments of conversation from the lead vehicles. Cunningham's voice came through in pieces, something about schedule and making good time. The damaged equipment turned his words into static more often than speech. Vasquez scanned the hillsides with eyes trained to detect what others overlooked. A patch of disturbed earth on the southern slope caught her attention. The color was slightly different from the surrounding soil, the texture inconsistent with natural erosion. She had seen that pattern before. Buried ordnance left signatures for those who knew how to read them. She reached for the radio to warn the lead vehicle. Static answered. She tried the secondary channel and received the same result. The convoy was 3 kilometers into the valley, and she had no way to communicate with anyone ahead of her. The road curved around a rock outcropping, and Vasquez noticed something that made her stomach tighten. No civilian traffic. For the past 20 minutes, they had not passed a single local vehicle, not a truck or a motorcycle or even a man on foot. The absence was a message written in silence. Civilians always knew when violence was coming. They disappeared before it arrived. Vehicle 5 ahead of her maintained steady speed, oblivious to the warning signs that screamed danger to anyone trained to hear them. The driver was a young sergeant named Williams who had been in country for 3 months. He followed Cunningham's lead because that was what soldiers did. Trust the chain of command. Execute the mission. Assume that someone higher up had assessed the risks. Vasquez began making small adjustments to her driving. She increased the gap between her vehicle and Vehicle 5, creating space to maneuver if contact occurred. She angled slightly toward the left side of the road, positioning her turret gunner with better sight lines to the southern ridge. Subtle movements that would look like normal driving corrections to anyone not paying attention. 3 vehicles ahead, Specialist Torres noticed the change. He had been watching Vasquez's MRAP in his side mirror, partly out of boredom and partly out of lingering guilt about his silence that morning. The woman Cunningham dismissed as useless was driving differently now. More aggressive positioning, more deliberate spacing. She moved like someone expecting trouble rather than someone following a routine supply run. Torres considered keying his radio to ask if she saw something. He decided against it. Cunningham monitored all channels and would mock anyone who raised concerns he had already dismissed. Vasquez spotted the first glint of metal on the northern ridge. Scope reflection, brief but unmistakable. A sniper or spotter tracking the convoy's movement. She shifted her gaze without turning her head, using peripheral vision to scan the terrain. A second reflection appeared 50 meters east of the first, then a third on the southern slope. She began counting positions. 12 confirmed before the convoy reached the first choke point, more appearing as they moved deeper into the valley. The ambush was already set. The enemy had watched them enter and was waiting for them to reach the optimal position before initiating contact. The road narrowed ahead, cliffs rising on the left and a steep drop on the right. No room to turn around, no space to maneuver. Once they entered that passage, they would be committed. Vasquez faced a choice she had hoped would never come. She could maintain her cover and pray that the ambush did not happen, that the men on the ridges were just observers who would let the convoy pass. Or she could act now, reveal everything she had buried, and try to save soldiers who had spent 4 months treating her as worthless. 18 months ago, she had watched her team die because she followed orders instead of instincts. She had promised herself she would never make that mistake again. The convoy entered the Narrows. Vasquez counted 32 distinct positions on the ridges above, a force large enough to destroy 6 vehicles and everyone inside them. Her hand moved to her rifle. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm that preceded violence. She was done being invisible. Vehicle 1 crossed an invisible line on the road ahead. The world erupted in fire and thunder. The ambush had begun, and Elena Vasquez felt something awaken that she had tried to kill. The driver died in that moment. The operator who had buried her rose from the grave. The improvised explosive device detonated beneath Vehicle 1 with a sound that split the world in half. The lead MRAP lifted off the road, its front end shattered, flames erupting from the engine compartment as it crashed back down on broken axles. Before the echo faded, a rocket-propelled grenade streaked down from the northern ridge and struck Vehicle 2 directly in the side armor. The explosion tore through metal and men with equal indifference. Gunfire erupted from both ridges. Muzzle flashes sparked along the hillsides like malevolent stars, dozens of weapons pouring rounds into the convoy from elevated positions. The kill zone had activated with textbook precision, trapping 6 vehicles in a corridor of death with no room to advance and no space to retreat. In Vehicle 3, Master Sergeant Cunningham sat frozen behind the wheel. His hands gripped the steering column with white-knuckled force, but his body refused to obey commands. Bullets sparked off the armor around him, the sound like hail against a metal roof, and his mind simply stopped processing. 15 years of service had not prepared him for this. Running convoys without incident had not taught him what to do when the world exploded and men started dying. Corporal Jennings scrambled for the mounted gun in Vehicle 4, screaming incoherently as he swung the barrel toward the hillside. He fired in long, undisciplined bursts, rounds spraying across the slope without pattern or purpose. Panic shooting, the kind that wasted ammunition and hit nothing. Vasquez was already moving. She exited Vehicle 37 through the rear hatch, her rifle up before her boots touched gravel. The chaos around her registered as data rather than terror. Muzzle flashes indicated 30-plus shooters across 2 ridges. RPG teams visible at 3 positions. Convoy disabled at the front, immobilized, survivors taking cover behind armor that would not protect them forever. She dropped to a crouch and moved toward a cluster of boulders 10 meters from the road. Her body flowed through the motion without conscious direction, muscle memory executing patterns drilled through thousands of hours of training. Cover. Assess. Engage. From the boulder position, she had clear sight lines to the northern ridge. An insurgent with an RPG launcher was reloading, preparing to fire on Vehicle 3, where Cunningham sat paralyzed. 400 meters. Uphill angle. Wind from the east at maybe 5 knots. Vasquez settled her breathing and squeezed the trigger. The insurgent dropped. The RPG clattered down the slope, unfired. She shifted targets before the body finished falling. A machine gun nest had the convoy pinned from a position halfway up the southern ridge. 2 men feeding belts, 1 firing. She put rounds through the gunner first, then the loader on the left, then the one scrambling to take over. 3 shots, 3 kills. Soldiers in the convoy stared at her through armored windows, their faces masks of disbelief. The woman they had mocked for 4 months moved through the kill zone like she had been born in one. No hesitation, no wasted motion. Every step deliberate, every shot precise. Vasquez reached Vehicle 5 and found Williams slumped over the steering wheel, blood spreading across his uniform from wounds she could not assess in the chaos. She checked his pulse. Weak but present. She dragged him from the driver's seat and positioned him behind the front wheel where the engine block provided maximum cover. Torres appeared beside her, his rifle shaking in his hands. His eyes were wide with the particular terror of a man who had never experienced real combat. "What do we do?" he shouted over the gunfire. Vasquez grabbed his shoulder and forced him to meet her eyes. "You stay here. Keep pressure on his wound. Do not move until I tell you." She did not wait for acknowledgement. More targets required attention, and every second of delay meant more insurgent ammunition finding friendly flesh. She crossed the road in a low sprint, bullets kicking dust behind her heels. A fighter emerged from behind a rock on the southern slope, AK raised to fire. Vasquez dropped in mid-stride without breaking her run. Another appeared to his left. Same result. The convoy survivors watched a transformation they could not comprehend. The quiet driver who absorbed insults without response had become something else entirely. She moved like water, finding cracks in stone, flowing through gaps in the enemy fire that should not have existed. Her rifle spoke in short, controlled bursts, each one followed by a body falling on the distant slopes. Cunningham finally emerged from his vehicle, pulled out by a sergeant who had regained enough composure to act. He stumbled to cover behind Vehicle 3 and looked around for the source of the precise fire that was systematically dismantling the ambush. He found Vasquez crouched behind a burned-out Vehicle 2, reloading her rifle with movements so fast they blurred. She glanced at him once, her face empty of everything except focus, then turned back to the ridges and resumed killing. 6 insurgents down, 26 remaining. The ambush that should have slaughtered them was beginning to falter, and the woman responsible had only started. Vasquez pressed her back against the burned armor of Vehicle 2 and counted her remaining ammunition. 2 magazines for the M4. 60 rounds against 26 fighters with superior positioning. The math demanded adaptation. She spotted a fallen insurgent 30 meters up the slope, his AK-47 lying beside him with a chest rig full of magazines. Enemy weapons meant enemy ammunition, and right now quantity mattered more than preference. She broke from cover in a low sprint, zigzagging through the sparse brush while rounds snapped past her head. The insurgents had identified her as the primary threat, and multiple barrels tracked her movement. She dove the last 3 meters and rolled behind a rock outcropping, her hand closing around the AK before she finished moving. The rifle was well maintained. She checked the chamber, confirmed a round was seated, and shouldered the weapon in a single fluid motion. The sights were crude compared to her M4 optic, but functional at the distances she needed. A fighter rose from concealment on the southern ridge, attempting to reposition for a better angle. Vasquez put 2 rounds through his chest before he completed his first step. Another emerged behind him, saw his companion fall, and hesitated for half a second. That hesitation ended his life. Torres watched from his position behind Vehicle 5, his hand still pressed against Williams's wound. The medic training he had received felt pathetically inadequate as blood seeped between his fingers, but he maintained pressure because the woman with the AK had told him to. She moved differently than any soldier he had ever seen. Regular infantry advanced in groups, covering each other, following doctrine drilled through months of training. Vasquez operated alone and made it look effortless. She flowed between cover positions like smoke, never visible for more than a second, never in the same place when return fire arrived. 3 more insurgents fell in rapid succession. Torres tried to track her shots, but lost count. The crack of her rifle came from different positions each time, the sound bouncing off the valley walls until it seemed like multiple shooters were engaging from everywhere at once. Vasquez felt the bullet before she heard it. A white-hot line across her left shoulder, shallow enough to miss bone and muscle, but deep enough to bleed. She dropped behind cover and assessed the damage without slowing her breathing. Grazing wound, painful but functional. She adjusted her shooting stance to reduce strain on the injury and kept moving. The insurgent who had hit her was good, better than the others. She marked his position by the muzzle flash and filed it away for later. First, she needed to eliminate the fighters who were maneuvering toward the convoy's wounded. 2 men worked their way down the northern slope, using terrain features to mask their approach. They were heading for Vehicle 1, where survivors from the initial blast had taken cover. Vasquez calculated angles and found a shot through a narrow gap between boulders. Difficult but possible. She steadied the AK against a rock, controlled her breathing, and fired twice. Both men dropped. Cunningham had pulled himself together enough to retrieve a rifle from one of the vehicles. He crouched behind an engine block and fired occasional shots toward the ridges, more for psychological comfort than tactical effect. His rounds hit nothing but dirt and sky. He watched Vasquez advance up the slope and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The woman he had called a quota higher moved like the operators he had seen in training videos, the ones from units whose names were never spoken aloud. Delta, Devgru, the quiet professionals who did the work that regular army could not. An insurgent broke from cover and sprinted toward Cunningham's position, rifle raised. Cunningham saw him coming, but his body locked up again, the same paralysis that had seized him when the ambush began. Vasquez dropped the attacker from 200 meters without pausing her advance. The insurgent collapsed 10 feet from Cunningham, dead before he hit the ground. She glanced at Cunningham once. The look contained no accusation, no contempt, no satisfaction, just assessment. He was alive. He was not combat effective. She moved on. The AK clicked empty. She discarded it and transitioned to her M4 without breaking stride, the weapon swap taking less than 2 seconds. 15 rounds remained. 9 insurgents down since she had acquired the enemy rifle. 17 total. 15 threats remaining. The ambush was failing. The fighters on the ridges had expected to slaughter a soft convoy and collect weapons from the wreckage. Instead, they were being systematically hunted by a single shooter who refused to miss. Vasquez paused behind a boulder and reloaded her final magazine. Blood ran down her left arm and dripped from her fingertips. She ignored it. Pain was information, not obstacle. The wound would matter later, after everyone still breathing made it out of this valley. She chambered around and continued up the slope toward the remaining positions. 15 more, and they could go home. Vasquez reached a position 40 meters below the primary insurgent concentration. 15 fighters held the high ground in a cluster of fortified positions reinforced with sandbags and natural rock formations. Taking them alone with half a magazine would require more than marksmanship. She keyed the radio she had taken from a dead insurgent and listened. Chatter in Pashto, panic voices discussing the shooter who was dismantling their ambush. They did not know how many attackers they faced. The chaos of the firefight had convinced them that a quick reaction force had arrived, not a single woman with a rifle and a grudge against dying. Vasquez looked down at the convoy. Torres and 2 other soldiers had pulled the wounded behind cover and were providing what medical aid they could. Cunningham crouched uselessly beside Vehicle 3. But 3 soldiers near Vehicle 4 had rifles up and appeared functional, waiting for direction that their frozen commander could not provide. She cupped her hands around her mouth and projected her voice down the slope. Vehicle 4, suppressing fire on the northern ridge. 30-round bursts. Keep their heads down. The soldiers hesitated for a fraction of a second, confused by orders coming from the woman they had been trained to dismiss. Then training overcame prejudice. Rifles rose and began hammering the enemy positions with disciplined fire. Vasquez used the covering barrage to advance. She crossed 20 meters of open ground while bullets from her own side kept the insurgents pinned. The sound of friendly fire cracking overhead was familiar, almost comforting. This was the symphony she had conducted dozens of times in places that did not exist on official maps. She reached the outer edge of the insurgent position and transitioned to close quarters. The first fighter appeared around a sandbag wall, his rifle pointed in the wrong direction. Vasquez shot him twice in the chest and stepped over his body before it finished falling. The second and third came together, drawn by the gunfire. She dropped them both with controlled pairs, 4 rounds total, each one placed center mass. A fourth emerged from a covered fighting hole and raised his weapon. She shot him through the forehead from 3 meters. Close quarters was different than distance work. Distance allowed precision and patience. Close quarters demanded speed and violence. Overwhelming force applied faster than the enemy could process. Vasquez had been trained to excel at both. She cleared 2 more fighting positions in rapid succession, her rifle speaking in short bursts that echoed off the rocks. Bodies accumulated behind her as she pushed deeper into the enemy stronghold. 18 kills total. 19 when a fighter tried to flee and caught a round between his shoulder blades. The communications equipment sat in a shallow cave at the center of the position. A radio operator was screaming coordinates into a handset, calling for reinforcements from another cell operating somewhere in the valley. Vasquez put a bullet through the radio first, then through the man holding it. She smashed the remaining equipment with the butt of her rifle. No reinforcements would be coming. No warnings would be sent. The fighters who remained were alone. Vasquez exited the cave and scanned for remaining threats. The suppressing fire from the convoy had ceased, either because the soldiers had run low on ammunition or because they realized the northern ridge had gone quiet. Bodies lay scattered across the fortified position, men who had woken up that morning expecting to kill Americans and collect bounties. She moved to the western edge of the position where the terrain sloped down toward a secondary cluster of fighters. 5 confirmed targets remained, dug in behind rocks with a clear field of fire toward the road. Taking them from above would expose her to fire from multiple angles. A young insurgent appeared from behind a boulder, his weapon pointed to the ground. His hands trembled, and his eyes showed white around the edges. 17 years old at most, maybe younger. A boy with a rifle who had not expected the ambush to become a slaughter. He saw Vasquez and froze. His finger did not move toward the trigger. His body language screamed surrender even before he dropped his weapon and raised his hands. Vasquez closed the distance in 3 strides and drove him to the ground. She zip-tied his wrists behind his back and checked him for concealed weapons. Clean. She dragged him to cover and left him face down in the dirt. Live prisoners' men intelligence. Names, locations, supply routes, future operations. The boy would talk because they always talked, and his information would save lives that Vasquez would never meet. 20 kills confirmed, 12 remaining. The final positions awaited on the upper ridge, and she could see them shifting nervously as they realized their ambush had become a death trap. She reloaded with ammunition stripped from the dead and began working her way toward the last cluster of resistance. The sun beat down on the valley without mercy, illuminating the blood on her arm and the bodies scattered across the slopes. Somewhere below, soldiers who had spent months mocking her were watching a woman they thought they knew become someone they could not comprehend. Vasquez did not think about their stares. She thought about angles and distances and the 8 men who still needed to die before her convoy could go home. 8 fighters remained on the upper ridge, clustered around a heavy machine gun position that commanded the entire valley. From their elevation, they could pin down the convoy indefinitely, waiting for reinforcements that would never arrive or simply executing the survivors one vehicle at a time. Taking them with a frontal assault would be suicide. The terrain offered no cover for the final 50 meters, nothing but open rocks swept by overlapping fields of fire. Vasquez studied the position from behind a boulder and considered her options. Direct approach meant death. Waiting meant the wounded below would bleed out before help arrived. The only path forward was the one that did not appear to exist. She circled wide, moving away from the convoy and deeper into the mountain terrain. The insurgents expected threats from below, from the road where the ambush had originated. They were not watching the goat trails that wound through the rocks behind their position, paths so narrow and treacherous that no sensible fighter would attempt them under fire. Vasquez was not a sensible fighter. She was something else entirely. The trail required her to sling her rifle and use both hands for climbing. Loose stones threatened to break free with every step, announcing her presence to anyone listening. She moved with the patience of a woman who had spent weeks in mountain terrain hunting targets that the regular military could not reach. Each foothold tested before weight transfer. Each handhold checked for stability. Silent progress measured in inches rather than feet. Cunningham had found a pair of binoculars in one of the vehicles. He scanned the ridges looking for the woman who had saved his life 3 times in the past 20 minutes, unable to locate her among the rocks and shadows. The upper positions still fired occasional bursts toward the convoy, keeping heads down, but the systematic slaughter from earlier had stopped. Whoever was killing his attackers had disappeared. Then he caught movement on the far side of the ridge. A figure working through terrain that should have been impassable, approaching the enemy position from an angle that made no tactical sense. He adjusted focus and recognized Vasquez, her left arm dark with blood, climbing toward 8 entrenched fighters with nothing but a rifle and a knife. "She is insane," he whispered to no one. Vasquez reached the top of the trail and paused to assess. The insurgents were focused downhill, their attention locked on the convoy below. The nearest fighter crouched behind a rock 10 meters away, his back to her approach. Beyond him, 3 others manned a machine gun, while 4 more held supporting positions. She drew her knife and closed the distance in absolute silence. The first insurgent died without making a sound. Her hand covered his mouth while the blade found the gap between his ribs, angled upward toward the heart. She lowered his body to the ground and moved to the next position. The second fighter heard something and began a turn. Vasquez drove the knife through his throat before his eyes could find her, catching his rifle as it fell to prevent the clatter of metal on stone. 2 down, 6 unaware. She worked through the outer positions with methodical precision. Each kill silent, each body lowered carefully to avoid alerting the others. The machine gun crew laughed about something, their voices carrying across the rocks, oblivious to the shadow moving through their ranks. The third and fourth insurgents died within seconds of each other, taken from behind in rapid succession. Vasquez cleaned her blade on the nearest body and checked her ammunition. Her rifle held 15 rounds. 4 targets remained around the machine gun, grouped close enough that surprise would last only a fraction of a second. She stepped into the open and fired. The first insurgent dropped before the others registered her presence. The second spun toward the sound and caught 2 rounds through the chest. The third scrambled for the machine gun and died with his hands on the charging handle. The fourth broke and ran, abandoning his position in pure animal panic. Vasquez tracked his flight across the rocky terrain. He made it 12 meters before her bullet found him between the shoulder blades. He fell forward and did not move. Silence descended on the valley. The gunfire that had echoed off the mountains for the past 15 minutes ceased entirely, leaving only the whisper of wind through the rocks and the distant crackle of flames from destroyed vehicles. Vasquez stood among the bodies and surveyed the battlefield below. The convoy stretched along the road in a line of wreckage and survival. Smoke rose from vehicles 1 and 2. Soldiers moved between the remaining wraps, tending to wounded and securing the perimeter. Torres looked up toward the ridge and saw her silhouette against the sky. 32 insurgents had set the ambush. 32 bodies now lay scattered across the slopes and positions. The woman who had driven their worst vehicle in the worst position had killed every single one of them. Vasquez began the descent toward her convoy, her rifle slung across her back and her wounded arm hanging at her side. Behind her, the upper ridge held nothing but corpses and the heavy machine gun that had never fired a shot against her people. The operator's work was complete. Now came the part she dreaded. The questions, the explanations, the end of the anonymity she had crossed an ocean to find. Vasquez reached the convoy and went straight to the wounded without acknowledging the stares that followed her every step. Williams lay behind Vehicle 5 where Torres had kept pressure on his wounds, his face pale, but his breathing steady. She knelt beside him and examined the damage with hands that had performed battlefield triage more times than she could count. 2 entry wounds in the lower abdomen, she said. Bleeding is controlled. He needs surgery within 4 hours or he loses the kidney. Torres watched her work with the same focus she had shown while killing. Her fingers probed the wounds, assessed internal damage, applied fresh bandages with mechanical efficiency. The blood on her hands mixed with the blood already coating her arm, all of it blending into a dark stain that covered her from elbow to fingertip. 3 other soldiers required immediate attention. Vasquez moved between them, prioritizing by severity, issuing instructions to the soldiers who hovered nearby. Keep this one elevated. Apply pressure here. Do not let him sleep. No one questioned her authority. The men who had spent 4 months following Cunningham's lead now obeyed the woman he had called worthless. Combat had a way of clarifying hierarchies that paperwork could never achieve. Cunningham stood behind Vehicle 3 with his hands braced against the armor. His stomach heaved, and he vomited onto the gravel, his body expelling the terror that his mind refused to process. The woman he had mocked and belittled had just killed 32 men and saved everyone who survived the initial blast. She had done alone, wounded, with a rifle and a knife against fortified positions. He wiped his mouth and looked toward where she worked on the wounded. What was she? What had he been tormenting for 4 months without understanding what lived beneath the surface? Vasquez finished stabilizing the last casualty and walked to Vehicle 4 where the radio still functioned. She keyed the handset and spoke with the calm precision of someone delivering a routine status report. Firebase Phoenix, this is Convoy 7 Actual. We have been ambushed at grid reference 47 Golf, November Papa 325-814. 6 vehicles, 2 destroyed, 1 disabled. 3 killed in action, 4 wounded requiring immediate evacuation. Enemy force of approximately 2 hostiles has been neutralized, requesting medical evacuation and quick reaction force for site security. How copy? The radio crackled with a response. Convoy 7, Phoenix copies all. Medevac spinning up now. QRF on route your position. ETA 45 minutes. Can you confirm enemy force neutralized? Confirmed, Vasquez replied. All hostile targets eliminated. LZ is hot, but manageable. Recommend approach from the south to avoid debris on the road. She released the handset and sat down on the running board of the MRAP. For a long moment, she simply breathed, her eyes fixed on the mountains where bodies lay scattered across the slopes. The adrenaline that had carried her through the firefight began to fade, leaving behind an exhaustion that settled into her bones. Torres approached slowly, uncertain how to address the woman who had transformed before his eyes. He stopped a few feet away and waited for her to acknowledge him. Vasquez looked up. Her expression held nothing he could read. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not the hollow stare of trauma. Just weariness. Who are you? Torres asked. The question carried no accusation, only genuine bewilderment. Someone who did not want to do this anymore, she replied. Torres considered the answer and found it insufficient but honest. He nodded once. Thank you. For saving us. For saving Williams. Vasquez did not respond. She turned her attention to her rifle and began the process of cleaning it, her hands moving through the familiar motions despite the tremor that had started in her fingers. Adrenaline leaving the system. The body's delayed reaction to sustained violence. Jennings walked past on his way to help with the wounded. He glanced at Vasquez and immediately looked away, unable to meet the eyes of the woman he had insulted hours earlier. His face burned with shame that words could not address. The soldiers worked in near silence, tending to their wounded and their dead while they waited for evacuation. No one spoke to Vasquez directly. No one knew what to say. She sat apart from the group, methodically cleaning her weapons, her hands shaking in small tremors that she did not try to hide. Cunningham watched her from across the convoy. The questions piling up in his mind demanded answers he was not entitled to ask. Who was she? Where had she learned to fight like that? Why had she hidden it? Why had she endured his abuse without revealing what she could do? The distant sound of rotors reached the valley. Helicopters approaching from the south, exactly as Vasquez had directed. She looked up at the sky, tracking the sound, then returned to her rifle. Help was coming. The wounded would survive. The dead would be honored. And Elena Vasquez would have to explain why a logistics specialist from Fort Lee had just single-handedly eliminated an ambush that should have killed them all. Colonel Raymond Pierce had commanded FOB Sentinel for 11 months without a significant incident. Convoys ran on schedule. Supplies reached their destinations. Soldiers completed their tours and rotated home. The monotony of successful logistics was exactly what he preferred. The radio call from Convoy 7 shattered that monotony with the force of an artillery strike. He stood in the command center, listening to the after-action reports filter in from the medevac crews and the Quick Reaction Force. 6 vehicles ambushed. 3 dead. 4 wounded. An enemy force of 32 fighters eliminated with 0 survivors. The numbers did not make sense. A convoy of support personnel should not have survived contact with 32 entrenched insurgents. They certainly should not have killed every single attacker. Pierce demanded clarification 3 times before accepting that the reports were accurate. One shooter, the QRF commander, reported over the radio. One of the convoy drivers. She took out the entire force by herself. Sir, I have been in this country for 4 tours, and I have never seen anything like the scene up here. Pierce ordered a full debrief upon the convoy's return and began making calls to higher command. Before he finished dialing the second number, a priority message arrived on his classified terminal. The header showed origination from Fort Bragg, Joint Special Operations Command. He opened the message and found a personnel file attached. The photograph showed Elena Vasquez in different uniform, different posture, different everything. Her eyes held the cold focus of someone who had moved beyond normal human limitations. The name beside the photo was not Vasquez. Codename Silhouette. 11 years with Delta Force. 47 confirmed high-value target eliminations. 7 commendations that would never appear in any public record. Languages spoken included Pashto, Arabic, Dari, and Russian. Specialized in infiltration, close-quarters combat, and precision marksmanship. The file continued for 12 pages. Operations in Syria, Yemen, Somalia, locations that officially never hosted American Special Operations personnel. Her team had been killed 18 months ago during a mission in Iran that did not exist. She had survived with wounds that should have been fatal, spent 4 months in a military hospital in Germany, and then vanished. JSOC had been quietly searching for her ever since. Their missing asset had resurfaced at a remote logistics base in Afghanistan, driving supply convoys and absorbing harassment from a master sergeant who had no idea what he was dealing with. Pierce closed the file as Captain Webb and Sergeant First Class Porter entered his office. They carried folders of their own, evidence they had gathered through parallel investigations that had led them to the same impossible conclusion. "We know who she is," Webb said. Pierce gestured for them to sit. "So do I. Fort Bragg just sent her complete jacket." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I do not know is how a Delta operator ended up driving trucks at my base for 4 months without anyone noticing." Porter opened her folder and spread photographs across the desk. "I noticed the scars during her quarterly physical. Bullet wounds, shrapnel extraction, surgical repairs. None of it matched her official medical records. Her file was sanitized." Webb added his evidence. "Her tactical awareness during convoy operations. Movement patterns consistent with advanced training. Physical markers, including shooting calluses and brass burns. I flagged her file 3 days ago, and my query pinged a JSOC server within hours." Pierce absorbed the information. The woman who had saved his convoy was not a troubled logistics specialist seeking anonymity. She was one of the most highly trained killers the United States military had ever produced, hiding in plain sight while a bureaucratic bully made her life miserable. The door opened and Master Sergeant Cunningham entered without knocking. His face was pale, and his uniform showed stains that suggested he had not changed since returning from the valley. He stopped when he saw the gathering in Pierce's office. "Sir, I wanted to submit my preliminary report on the ambush," he said. His voice carried none of its usual confidence. Pierce studied him for a long moment. "Sit down, Master Sergeant." Cunningham sat. His hands trembled slightly against his thighs. Pierce slid a photograph across the desk. It showed Vasquez in her Delta uniform, medals visible on her chest, the insignia of a unit that did not officially exist displayed on her shoulder. "Do you recognize this woman?" Pierce asked. Cunningham stared at the photograph. The color drained from his face as recognition settled in. His mouth opened, but no words emerged. "That is Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez," Pierce continued. "Codename Silhouette. 11 years with Delta Force. 47 confirmed kills before today. You have spent the last 4 months harassing, belittling, and abusing one of the most decorated special operations soldiers in American military history. Cunningham's hands stopped trembling. They went completely still, the paralysis of a man watching his career disintegrate. Your convoy preparation was negligent, Pierce continued. You dismissed intelligence warnings. You assigned a malfunctioning vehicle to the soldier who ended up saving everyone. You created a hostile environment that would have gotten you court-martialed even without the ambush. The fact that she had to reveal herself to save your people makes this worse, not better. Sir, I did not know, Cunningham managed. No, Pierce agreed. You did not. And that is exactly the problem. You assumed you knew everything about a soldier based on her gender and her assignment. Your assumptions nearly killed 12 people. He pressed a button on his desk phone. 2 military police officers entered the office. Master Sergeant Cunningham, you are relieved of duty pending investigation. You will face charges including creation of a hostile work environment, conduct unbecoming, and negligent performance of duty resulting in the deaths of 3 soldiers. Remove him. The MPs escorted Cunningham from the office. He did not resist. He did not speak. He walked like a man already sentenced, already buried, already forgotten. Pierce turned to Webb and Porter. Find Vasquez. Tell her I want to speak with her privately. And tell her she is not in trouble. She saved lives today. The least I can do is give her the respect she deserves. Vasquez sat across from Colonel Pierce in an office that felt smaller than it should have. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting the same sterile glow on both of them. Her arm had been properly bandaged now, the wound cleaned and dressed by medics who treated her with a reverence usually reserved for visiting generals. Pierce studied her for a long moment before speaking. I have your complete file. 11 years of operations that officially never happened. 47 targets eliminated before yesterday. A team lost in a country we were never in. Vasquez met his gaze without flinching. Then you know why I left. I know what the file says. I want to hear it from you. She considered the request. Outside, the base continued its routines. Soldiers walked to chow. Vehicles rumbled past. Life proceeded as though nothing had changed, even though everything had. I watched 6 people die because I followed orders instead of instincts, she said. My team trusted command, and command sent us into a trap. I was the only one who walked out. She paused. I spent 4 months in a hospital learning how to breathe without pain. When I could finally walk again, I decided I was done being a weapon. I wanted to be invisible. I wanted to drive trucks and count boxes and never pull a trigger again. Pierce nodded slowly. And then today happened. And then today happened, she agreed. He leaned back in his chair. Fort Bragg wants you back. JSOC has been looking for you since you disappeared from Germany. Apparently Silhouette is too valuable an asset to let drive convoys in Afghanistan. Vasquez shook her head. I'm not going back to what I was. I cannot. Pierce let the silence stretch between them. Then he spoke again, his voice softer than before. They are offering options. You do not have to return to active operations. They want you at the training facility, teaching the next generation, passing on what you know so others can survive what you survived. She looked down at her hands. The tremor from the afternoon had faded, leaving behind the steady grip she had cultivated over 11 years. Teaching meant staying connected to the world she had tried to escape, but it also meant ensuring that others would not die the way her team had died. I need time to think, she said. Take 24 hours, Pierce replied. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that what you did today matters. You saved lives. The soldiers in that convoy will go home to their families because you chose to act. That is worth something, regardless of what comes next. Vasquez stood and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. The men who harassed me. The ones who stayed silent while it happened. What happens to them? Cunningham faces court-martial. The others will receive formal reprimands and mandatory training. Pierce met her eyes. I cannot undo 4 months of what you endured, but I can make sure it is documented and addressed. And I can promise you that every soldier on this base now knows what you are capable of. No one will make the mistake of underestimating you again. She nodded once and left the office. The night passed slowly. Vasquez walked the perimeter of the base under stars that looked the same here as they had in a dozen other countries where she had fought and bled and killed. She thought about her team, their faces still clear in her memory, despite the months she had spent trying to forget. She thought about the convoy, about Torres holding pressure on Williams while gunfire cracked overhead, about the young insurgent she had spared because information mattered more than vengeance. By morning, she had made her decision. She found Pierce in the command center and told him she would accept the training position. She would return to Fort Bragg, not as an operator, but as an instructor. She would teach young soldiers how to survive ambushes, how to fight when outnumbered, how to make the impossible possible when everyone around them was dying. She would give them the skills that had kept her alive, and maybe some of them would come home when they should have died. Pierce made the calls. Within a week, Vasquez was gone from FOB Sentinel, transferred to a program that did not appear in official records. The aftermath unfolded over the following months. Cunningham's court-martial resulted in reduction in rank and dishonorable discharge. Torres testified against him, finally finding the voice he had lost during 4 months of silence. Jennings received formal reprimand and transferred to a unit where his attitudes would be corrected or terminated. Porter and Webb received commendations for their investigative work, their separate paths having converged on a truth that mattered. The survivors of Convoy 7 established an annual gathering, meeting each year on the anniversary of the ambush to honor the 3 who died and the woman who saved them. They never learned her real name. They never saw her again, but they remembered what she had done, and they told the story to anyone who would listen. If you're still watching this, maybe you know something about carrying weight that no one else can see, about being underestimated by people who should know better, about the moment when you have to choose between staying invisible and doing what only you can do. Maybe you have been Elena Vasquez, sitting in silence while someone decided you were worthless. Or maybe you've been Torres, watching wrong happen and saying nothing. Either way, the choice is always there. What you do with it defines everything. 6 months after leaving Afghanistan, Elena Vasquez stood at the edge of a training course at Fort Bragg. Young candidates ran through obstacles in the Carolina heat, their bodies pushed to limits they had not known existed. One young woman struggled with a heavy pack, her legs shaking, her face twisted with effort that was not quite enough. Vasquez walked over and crouched beside her. She adjusted the pack straps, redistributing the weight across the woman's shoulders. Her hands moved with the same precision she had shown while clearing insurgent positions. "You are stronger than you think," she said. "Show them." The young woman looked up, saw something in Vasquez's eyes that went beyond encouragement. She nodded, pushed herself upright, and continued the course. Vasquez watched her go. Behind her, mountains rose against a blue sky. Ahead, another generation of warriors trained for battles they could not yet imagine. She had wanted to be invisible. Instead, she had become something else. A teacher, a survivor, a woman who had buried herself and risen when it mattered most. The driver who saved them all.